I'm glad that everyone is here. I suppose this is the start of our news conference. Um, and my name is Jackie Drexler. I'm a member of the Stop Holtec Coalition, the Rockland Coalition to End the New Jim Crow Environmental Committee, and I am a Valley Cottage resident. We are holding this news conference today to release major new information on the Indian Point nuclear reactor situation. Today, over 300 groups, elected officials, and individuals are sending a letter to the governor, attorney general, and commissioners of the departments of environmental, conservation, health, and public service. This letter, first of all, commends Governor Hochul for signing into law the discharge ban bill, as it is a major step in addressing the pollution from the site. The letter then calls on the state to apply right to know and good government practices and to apply an overlooked section of the Federal Clean Water Act to the reactor site to address nuclear pollution and to provide adequate public involvement. I will introduce our speakers, and following their presentations, there will be time for a question and answer period. Reporters, if you have any questions, please identify yourselves and put your questions into the chat. The speakers will put their information in the chat as well if you want to reach them to do follow-up interviews. For people present other than reporters, we will try to answer your questions as time allows. This news conference will be recorded and will be available. And now for a short introduction to our speakers. Our first speaker is Ann Rabe. Ann Rabe is the Environmental Policy Director of the New York Public Interest Research Group and has over 40 years of experience working on nuclear pollution issues. Next, we will hear from attorney S.D. Smith, who is a member of the Ramapo-Munsee Nation. He has been a lecturer at Virginia Tech and the University of Richmond and has assisted Navajo and Tohono O'odham on environmental issues. Our third speaker is Dr. Gordon Edwards. We are honored to have Dr. Gordon Edwards with us, an international expert on nuclear energy and waste. Dr. Edwards is a retired professor of science and mathematics at Vanier College and is a member of the Canadian Committee for Nuclear Responsibility. Our last speaker will be Tina Bonger. Ms. Bonger is a leader with United for Clean Energy and the Stop Holtec Coalition. She is a Peekskill resident. So good afternoon, and Ann, please take it away.
Thank you, Jackie. We're here today to talk about the need for an environmentally sound path forward on the pollution problems suspected and known from the Holtec Indian Point nuclear reactor site in Buchanan, the county of Westchester. And our requests are based on the Clean Water Act, the good government practices that the government should practice, and right to know, as well as the principles of protecting public health and the Hudson River Valley ecosystem. First, there's a quick snapshot looking at the Indian Point nuclear power plants, which operated for 59 years. They started one in 1962, two in 1974, and three in 1976, and ceased all operations in 2021. Just want to put in perspective in terms of the timetable on the reactor's operation, that when they first started in 1962, DEC and the Environmental Protection Agency did not exist. Those agencies were not started until 1970. And the Clean Water Act only passed in 1972. So early days of the operation of these reactors, there may not have been a lot of oversight by state and federal agencies. It would have only been the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so just putting that in perspective, there is a need to relook at many aspects of these operating reactors in terms of possibility of discharges and spills that may have polluted the Hudson River Valley. But first, we want to alert the media and the public about an alarming whistleblower report. A whistleblower, a worker at the Holtec Pilgrim reactor undergoing decommissioning as well, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, yesterday wrote a letter to state agencies saying that there had been a breach of trust by Holtec at the Pilgrim Station Management to not discharge 1 million gallons of contaminated wastewater. Tritium contaminated wastewater, of course. And recently, the Massachusetts EPA had denied their permit request for discharging. So according to this worker, staff are being directed now to install, they have installed evaporators and are boiling away the water volume. The heating elements raise the temperature of the contaminated water to approximately 117 Fahrenheit. And then this evaporated water is then discharged as an airborne release to the environment, air pollution. So these are very serious charges. And we are today calling on our DEC and our Department of Health to do an immediate on-site investigation of the Holtec Indian Point site. If it's true, if these allegations are true at Pilgrim, we just want to make sure that our state ensures Holtec is not doing a similar activity at the Indian Point site. And we have in the news release, which we'll put in the chat, we have a link to the whistleblower's 2-page letter. It's quite detailed and quite technical. Next, I wanted to talk about our main request today to the governor, attorney general, and the 3 state agencies is that New York State set up an Indian Point pollution and wastewater plan and process based on the principles of prioritizing health and the environment, a fair, judicious, transparent, environmentally sound approach, meaningful public participation, including the establishment of a Hudson River Advisory Group and an expert advisory group. And the first task at hand is for this process to focus on isolating the radioactive wastewater from the environment. What's the best, most protective way for on-site storage of the tritium contaminated wastewater? Away from the river, an above ground facility, and a monitored and retrieval facility. Those are some of the key criteria that we would like to see the state focus on and to start this process as soon as possible. Another key request is comprehensive testing of the polluted wastewater for both radionuclides and toxic chemicals. At the Pilgrim reactor, again, they found PFAS, known as the forever chemicals, and other toxic chemicals in their wastewater testing recently. So it's incumbent on the state agencies, on the DEC and DOH, to do testing, not Holtec, but they should do the testing of all the possible radionuclides and all the what's called the EPA priority pollutant list of toxic chemicals. And they should do them in laboratories that have the detection level capability to make sure that they find PFAS if it doesn't indeed exist. Secondly, and equally important, is we've uncovered the fact that the Department of Health, being the first state agency in the country, conducted a very extensive baseline study, ecosystem monitoring study in 1958, before the Indian Point 1 started. So it was a 20-mile radius study, and they comprehensively tested in 20 miles, fish and wildlife, cow's milk, rabbit thyroid, soil, sediment, air, water. They tested everything to get a baseline before the reactor started. This is a map that Riverkeeper has done showing you the 10-mile zone and then the 50-mile zone around Indian Point. So we're asking for an immediate comprehensive ecosystem monitoring process testing plan today to start, so that we can look at and compare to the 1958 baseline study, and going out 20 miles. And if it continues to find contamination, to continue to go out further in terms of a radius, in terms of the testing. We want to have full public input on the testing protocols with the independent expert. And this is a critical moment to look at whether there's any pollution from past discharges or spills from those 3 reactors that operated for 59 years. And this is a graphic just showing the pathways of exposure, the key pathways of exposure. Obviously, the reactors, when they were operating, they were emitting radioactive air emissions, and they settle on the grass. The cows eat the grass, and the cows can get strontium-90, one of the radionuclides, in their milk. So that's one of the pathways. Contaminated fish is another pathway. I just want to mention that, these 2 requests for a wastewater management process and a pollution investigation are standard operating procedure for addressing suspected or known contamination. under our state and federal policies. It's a standard operating procedure for a state superfund or a nuclear waste site being remediated by the Department of Energy, by EPA, or by our DEC in relation to requiring the suspected or known polluter to pay for the testing and have total oversight by the DEC and the Department of Health to ensure it's done correctly, and providing adequate public participation. Also, in terms of the on-site storage proposal for the wastewater, this is something that New York State has championed twice in the past. At the West Valley, a nuclear waste site south of Buffalo, with a state-funded study in 2008, and in the 1990s, the Assembly and Senate introduced a reactor on-site above-ground storage bill in relation to low-level reactive waste. So I'm going to end there and just end with Pete Seeger, the icon leader of cleaning up the Hudson River. And a big thank you to Governor Hochul for signing the discharge ban bill into law. Thank you. And our next speaker is Attorney Smith.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yes, I'm SD Smith. I'm a advisor to the Ramapo-Muncie Nation. And we are the descendants of the original people of the Hudson River Valley. And we are the keepers of the past. We're the guardians of the passageway, which is the Ramapo Mountains through the and river through the mountain range here. Imbi Imbumasa Wakanum, Miniwachoni, water is life. So our language and our heritage is what we use to guide many of our actions. So we recently passed a rights of nature bill. I saw in the comments that there was a question about whether the Green Amendment applies, and that is our position that it does, and that should inform all of our actions. And we are embodying that through passage of a rights of nature bill. So we're recognizing the rights of the Hudson River to be healthy and secure. In our language, the Muncie language, the Hudson River is called the Mahi-Kanatuk, the Mohi-Kanatuk, which means the river that flows both ways. And that's a recognition that this river is somewhat unique in these lands in the United States, in that it's not only an estuary, but it's also what would be called a fjord, where it's at sea level all the way up to Albany. So the river literally does flow both ways from where Indian Point is down south to Manhattan up to Albany. So the entire river we are concerned about, not just the one section, but we are concerned about any part of the river and making sure that it's healthy. To kind of give you an example of why we need to apply the precautionary principle is they're eagles. The eagles have returned to the river. I saw an eagle recently catch a fish in the river right across from Indian Point. In Muncie language, we call the eagle Wapalanau. And finally, we had the Atlantic sturgeon, the endangered Atlantic sturgeon that lives in the ocean but comes back to rivers, including the Hudson River, to live and to spawn, Kapaksau. So the Green Amendment, rights of nature, these are all part of our customary law as Ramapo people, as indigenous people. So we all have a duty to respect and protect the Mahi-Kanatuk. We sent a letter putting the governments on notice about our opposition to the dumping. And I'll just run through this list quick. But all of us have a duty to respect and protect the river. Holtec Corporation, we don't see them as opponents. We see them as people that we need to have do the job that needs to be done. And this is true for all of us. So we want to make sure that this company does what it is supposed to do. And so that's why we're glad that the governor signed the bill into law. So we have the governor, the Attorney General of New York State, the United States EPA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Energy, Fish and Wildlife Service, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Health and Human Services, NOAA, Department of Public Service, and the director of the Decommissioning Oversight Board. And we all, Department of Environmental Conservation, all of us have a duty to protect and respect the Mahikanatuq. New York State is a Nuclear Regulatory Commission agreement state. So it has a vital role in ensuring the integrity of the Hudson River and the health, safety, and welfare of all of us, human and non-human, that depend on the river. The Federal Clean Water Act is designed to protect the Hudson River from being degraded. So what that means technically is that Part 125 of the Code of Federal Regulations addresses technology-based effluent limitations, and then Part 131, water quality standards, use designation, and anti-degradation provisions of the federal law. So the federal law reinforces the power of the state to protect the environment. So the old saying that dilution is the solution to pollution, that is no longer law, it's no longer acceptable. It never was in terms of our health, safety, and welfare. It never was acceptable, but the law has caught up to that. Dilution is no solution. Dilution is actually illegal. Specifically, the federal government and the law, which also applies to the states, bans pollution dilution as an alternative to waste treatment. The use of any river, lake, stream, or ocean as a waste treatment system is unacceptable. So not only are we looking at not using the river to dilute the poisons, but the river itself, the integrity of the river, the health of the river needs to be maintained. Finally, we have President Biden's executive order on environmental justice. We need to listen to the science, and the science, as you will hear later on by our other speakers, is really shows how deadly these chemicals are that we're dealing with here. There's also in the executive order a mandate to improve public health, to protect our environment, to ensure access to clean air and clean water, to hold polluters accountable, and finally to promote environmental justice. There are a number of different communities that draw their drinking water from the river as well. So to sum it all up, we are thankful to the governor for signing the bill into law, and are looking forward to making sure that all the parties involved in this, including Holtec, are held responsible for the duty to respect and protect the Mahikanatuq, the Hudson River, the river that flows both ways. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Gordon Edwards, and I see he's with us. Oh, wonderful.
Hello, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. In 2007, I was invited to give a talk on the shores of the Hudson River. At that time, I began by saying the age of nuclear power is winding down, but the age of nuclear waste is just beginning. Well, here we are. Welcome to the brave new world of human-made radioactive waste. It is a toxic legacy that will last for 100,000 years and more, because no one knows how to turn off radioactivity. The only thing we can do is keep it out of the environment, keep it out of the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. Chronic exposure to radioactivity is harmful to all living things, even in small amounts, causing cancers and other diseases. It also damages the reproductive abilities of all species. Holtec wants to dump 1.3 million gallons of radioactively contaminated water into the Hudson River. Many health professionals would be appalled at the prospect of dumping any cancer-causing pollutant directly into the river. The Hudson is the source of life-giving water for animals, fish, birds, plants, insects, and of course, humans. Holtec says the wastewater was treated to remove radioactivity, but in fact, Holtec has no technology to remove a single atom of the radioactive tritium contamination. That tritium was created as a byproduct inside the Indian Point reactors. Now Holtec wants to just dump it directly into the river with no treatment whatsoever because there simply is no treatment. Last week, New York State passed a law prohibiting the dumping because it would further degrade the water quality of the Hudson River, which is already suffering from serious PCB contamination. Unlike PCBs, which are very difficult to remove from drinking water, tritium is impossible to remove. It all goes right to the tap. Halfway around the world, Japan wants to dump 1.3 million metric tons of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. They plan to start tomorrow, August 24th. The dumping has been vehemently opposed by Japanese fishermen, as well as the governments of South Korea, China, and several Pacific Island nations, including independent scientists around the world. The contaminated water in Japan comes from the triple meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi 12 years ago. Huge amounts of fresh water had to be used every day since the accident to cool the melted cores of the crippled reactors. That water has become heavily contaminated and has been accumulating year after year. Japan now wants to dump it all into the Pacific Ocean over a period of 30 years. Like Holtec, the Japanese cannot remove the tritium. So what is happening at Indian Point is really part of a global pattern. Industry wants to rid itself of the responsibility of looking after at least some of the voluminous toxic waste that it has created. Let me explain the particular problem with tritium. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very important element. It is by far the most abundant element in the entire universe. It has the simplest possible atom, a single proton at the center and a solitary electron in orbit around that. Two hydrogen atoms are found in every water molecule, and water covers 75% of the Earth's surface. More importantly, every living thing requires water. Each living cell is filled with at least 2/3 water by mass. Every organic molecule in our bodies, all the carbohydrates, the proteins, the lipids, even the DNA molecules, are made up mainly by splicing carbon and hydrogen atoms together. Tritium is, as I said, radioactive hydrogen. It is created as a byproduct inside every nuclear power reactor. It behaves exactly the same way that normal hydrogen behaves, except that the tritium atom is unstable or radioactive. Every tritium atom will suddenly disintegrate without warning. Ordinary hydrogen atoms just don't do that. Now, a radioactive disintegration is a kind of subatomic explosion. It emits a piece of subatomic shrapnel called atomic radiation, very harmful to nearby living cells because it breaks molecular bonds at random, including DNA. Now, if a cell with damaged DNA reproduces, it can develop into a cancer, or it can give rise to genetic illnesses in future offspring. Defective embryos may also result in a pregnant female. In any population of creatures, chronic exposure to atomic radiation causes an increase of cancers of many kinds. Atomic radiation also damages reproductive cells, such as eggs and sperm. These genetic damages can be passed on as maladies to offspring and even transmitted to future generations. Genetic damage occurs in every species that has been studied in the laboratory. Evaporation of tritium-contaminated water, which is also called tritiated water, results in airborne radioactive water vapor. When it condenses, it comes back to Earth as radioactive dewdrops or radioactive raindrops or radioactive snowflakes. Breathing in radioactive water vapor is much more biologically damaging than drinking radioactive water or eating food with organically bound tritium. Organically bound tritium is tritium that has been incorporated into organic molecules. In Canada and other countries, large volumes of tritium-contaminated water have been stored for years at a time in stainless steel drums, carefully sealed to prevent evaporation. The International Atomic Energy Agency points out that stainless steel drums can last for over 100 years before being replaced, And in that time, over 99% of the tritium atoms will have disintegrated harmlessly inside those containers. Other containers can also be used, such as rubber bladders. One of the best containers that can be used is thick glass. There is no reason why the Indian Point tritiated water could not be stored for a century or more rather than dumping it into the Hudson River. A river is not a radioactive waste facility, nor should it be treated as a radioactive sewer. More broadly, we as citizens of planet Earth should resist the inevitable pressures from nuclear promoters and defenders to allow the unwise dispersal of human-made radioactive waste materials into the environment of living things or into articles of commerce, such as radioactively contaminated scrap metal that ends up yielding such things as radioactive zippers, radioactive safety pins, radioactive knives and forks, etc. Am I still connected? I think I'm not. Hello, can anybody hear me?
Yes, you are connected and we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Just a final few words, if I may, about tritium. Do not believe spokespersons of the nuclear establishment when they say that the total radiation dose from tritium is, quote, negligible, unquote. Negligible means it can be neglected and it is being neglected. That's not a solution to pollution. They have been singularly unscientific in dealing with the data about tritium. The nuclear establishment downplays or ignores or even denies the following points. First, the well-established fact that tritium is at least 2 or 3 times more biologically damaging in comparison with gamma radiation once it's inside the body, and maybe up to 15 times more damaging. Second, the fact that a large population exposed to a small dose will show the same number of radiation-induced cancers as a small population exposed to a correspondingly large dose. So by spreading tritium into the Hudson River, we're exposing an inordinately large number of living organisms to tritium that don't have to be exposed. The important role of organically bound tritium in bioaccumulation and biomagnification is also ignored by the nuclear establishment, as well as the fact that females typically store twice as much tritium in their body fat than similarly sized males. 3 more points. The establishment ignores the deleterious effects of tritium on developing embryos and the fact that tritium is routinely incorporated directly into DNA molecules, unlike any other radioactive material except carbon-14. The fact that tritium, when released to the environment, remains in the environment for 1 or 2 centuries is conveniently ignored. Thank you for your attention.
And now Tina will be speaking for Stop Holtec Coalition.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. That's amazing to hear you. And it's something that we really count on in this state-led waste management process that we're advocating is going to be centering advocates, experts, and hearing from advocates like you. So I really appreciate it. So why are we here? Well, we're here really, I think, because in December, the Stop Holtec Coalition started organizing, and we really seized public power about this radioactive wastewater being dumped. And we had 446 and 526 signatures as of this morning on our change.org petition. We've had 35 municipalities pass municipal resolutions. We've had 3 of our largest counties, and we even could get one from New York City Council. We kept pushing this fall, but and anyway, 138 environmental and community groups who were critical in getting us to sign the petitions and calling Governor Hochul and doing the right thing, as the Cortland town member Jim Creighton says. And so Friday, August 18th, Governor Hochul signed the Senator Harcum and Assemblymember Levenberg Save the Hudson bill. And that was after our New York Senate passed is 63-0. They passed nothing and agree on nothing. It was a bipartisan unilateral agreement. We should not dump in the Hudson. And so thanks to Governor Hochul, there won't be any permanent damage to our $3.8 billion tourism economy, and also our Hudson River biota, as Stephen Smith, the attorney from the Ramapo, outlined for us. So the most frequent questions we got by the public when asking them to sign and call the governor's office, it was, how could this be happening? How could this be allowed to be happening? Which is a really good question. And a very good question for decommissioning power plants, not operating power plants, but decommissioning power plants. And the answer really is because we need regulatory change. And like this New York State led waste management process, that would center the work and oversight of our excellent New York State agencies, and with public participation, which is frankly missing and critical in this. So, oops, I am so sorry about this. I skipped ahead to that. So we've had 300 environmental organizations and individuals and elected officials who support this kind of pivot to this process, and we're very proud of that. It's taken some time to educate people and everything else about that. So our real ask and our next steps, and that is to have emergency meetings with Governor Hochul's office, and also our state agencies. The Attorney General's office has been a great friend of ours. We've been meeting with them about all of our concerns about this decommissioning that's already happening, that we don't know a lot about. The Department of Public Service, the Public Service Commission, and the Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of Health. So with that, I want to say thank you to all the press that is here. I look forward to answering any questions. I'm going to put my name and email in the chat. And if you would like to get in touch with the Stop Holtec Coalition, or others who would like to join us in those meetings with the agencies, or you would as members of the press, you're welcome to. I like to say, I have to ask all of my colleagues there, but anyway, so I am going to switch out of this. I'm going to stop sharing.
So boy, what great presentations. Thank you to everyone so far. We have Ann Rabe and Attorney S.T. Smith and Dr. Gordon Edwards and Tina Bonger, and they're all going to put their names and contact information into the chat for anyone who would like to be in touch with them. So we're going to turn this over to the Q&A portion now. And once again, I ask that any reporters identify yourself in the chat. Make sure that your screen reflects your name. And I actually see one question which I think has been answered so far, which was that Regina at Peekskill Herald would like to have Dr. Gordon's statement, and that we will make sure that she gets that. And I'm not seeing anyone else that has questions in the chat at this point in time.
Jackie, can we just have the reporters raise their hand, and then Doug will unmute them? It's just easier that way, if that's okay.
That's fine with me. I do see names here I don't recognize, so I'm assuming they may be reporters or other interested people.
And okay, Holtec has a fiduciary responsibility to its investors, and especially in light of the message of this whistleblower, if the fine in the bill that was passed is less costly than doing the right thing with the waste, how do we keep Holtec from doing what makes them the most money instead of the right thing?
Yeah, that's what our requests are all about. We're asking for questions first from reporters. And if you could
I'm
please
with
identify yourself.
WBAI FM. I do the radio show Ecologic.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Ann Rabe with NYPIRG, and that's exactly what our requests today are about, supported by 300 groups and elected officials, is number one, that the state can and should take the lead under the Federal Clean Water Act anti-degradation provision that fully supports the governor's ban discharge law. And they should immediately do three things. They should immediately have the state agencies inspect the Holtec Indian Point reactor facility to make sure that there is nothing happening as the whistleblower alleging is happening at Pilgrim. Number two, they should immediately start a pollution and wastewater management process with public input and independent experts to develop an on-site storage plan that works for the tritium wastewater. And number three, they should immediately, DEC and DOH, conduct a comprehensive ecosystem.
Did you start this? I think, Anne, you could continue answering the question. I don't know what happened.
Sure, but I just see that a reporter from City Limits is wondering if we could comment on whether Holtec may still be able to move forward with the dumping plans, even with the law, such as through possible legal action, or if the NRC has the ability to override the legislation. I'll start and then others can chime in. I think that there is clear authority for New York State to ban the discharge under the Clean Water Act's Part 131 anti-degradation provision. The state has the lead. They are not federally preempted by the Atomic Energy Act and thus the NRC. We've consulted with a number of environmental attorneys around the country, including a retired federal environmental attorney, and they said it's crystal clear. It has not been litigated, but it's crystal clear that provision 131, the anti-degradation provision in the Clean Water Act regulations, part 40 CFR, state they're not preempted by the Atomic Energy Act. Thus, the NRC is not federally preempted from New York State taking the lead and saying, no, you do not degrade Hudson River with this tritium wastewater discharge. So that's the situation. If NRC or Holtec decides to take legal action, I think that would be very unfortunate. And we feel that the state would win in court based on our consultations with a number of environmental attorneys.
And
I'd like
can
to
I
ask,
just catch the name of the person who's from City Limits? Or you could put it into the chat.
Yeah, also it's important to note that the law that was signed by the governor bans the discharge of radionuclides into the Hudson River. And so we are expecting that the state of New York will enforce that law. It's plain and simple.
And I'd just like to say that Holtec itself, as a private company, has a lot of business in front of the federal government and state governments right now. And so they would lose in the court of public opinion. And it's very important here because the elected officials really have stepped up to the voice of the people to represent what we think is the best process. So I just want to point that out. Yes, there's the court of law, but there's also the court of public opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Sally Geller from Ecologic. What is the record of New York State in enforcement and collecting fines? I.e., does this law have the teeth that we hope it has?
We believe so. I mean, it set up a separate enforcement section in the law, specifically in terms of enforcing the ban on the discharge. The Department of Environmental Conservation has a substantial enforcement division. And we believe so. I mean, the light is shining on the DEC, and we're sure that they will fully enforce this law. And we talked with the Attorney General's office the other day, and they also confirmed that, Holtec has agreed to allow the Department of Health to test the wastewater, and they didn't see that they didn't see any possibility that Holtec would negate their agreement.
Thank you.
So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat from reporters. And so I guess if there are other people that would like to ask questions that are attending this, you could feel free to raise your hand or put your question in the chat, so long as you identify yourself, please.
Actually, Jackie, in the Q&A section, which is a separate chat, there are a number of questions from reporters. Yes.
I don't see that. Okay. Then you're going to have to see that on your screen and handle it. I don't see that here.
Oh, I'm sorry. So Rick from
Okay.
Examiner Media is saying, are you taking this step because you don't trust Holtec will follow the law the governor signed? No comment, but we feel it's important for the public to know that the governor is backed up legally by the Federal Clean Water Act anti-degradation provision. And so it's extra security. And we felt the need also to point out that, Holtec, according to this whistleblower, is allegedly heating the tritium contaminated wastewater, which, as Dr. Edwards says, is a major pathway of exposure, inhalation, possibly poisoning the workers, possibly poisoning the homes that are nearby. So this is really serious, and that's why our first call is for an immediate inspection by the state agencies of the Holtec Indian Point reactor site, and obviously for them to contact the Massachusetts authorities about their investigation on that whistleblower's charge. And then Catherine from EACE, how will violating the illegality of discharging treated water be enforced? We just addressed that. Thank you, Catherine. And how can the public affect vigilance on this law? Does anyone want to answer that?
Well, if I may say something on that, Dr. Edwards here. I do think that public understanding of the nature of the problem is important. Once they understand that tritium really makes radioactive water molecules, and that's why it cannot be removed from drinking water, either in the river itself by Holtec or in your own home. And it's also important to realize that although tritium is completely harmless outside the body, because when it disintegrates, it gives off a particle called a beta particle that has a very short range. It's only able to affect 1 or 2 cells at a time. Nevertheless, inside the body, it is much more dangerous than gamma radiation, and consequently, it's once you drink it or eat food contaminated with it, once people start to understand that, then I think you can have an aroused public opinion much more easily. So I think the key to public vigilance is public understanding, and one has to strip away the mystification that the industry and the regulator are equally guilty of mystifying people, so that they feel unable to understand what the problem is.
I'm so grateful that you said that, because what we've really led is a public education campaign to simplify some of these things. And I just want to say, so after this news conference, for instance, in the middle of my work day for my small business, how will the public affect this? I'm going to reach out to Assemblymember Levenberg's office to contact the inspector on site to see whether or not this has, if their office can find out whether the inspector has reports of any kind of equipment or anything else that's going on at Indian Point that's gone on at Pilgrim. So that's how we're doing it. We're doing it on a grassroots level, and then we're doing it on a regulatory level, and this is it. So thank you.
And this is Jackie Drexler here. I would just like to jump in and say that the whole issue of inspectors on site is another myth, because they're not on site. They have to be called in. They can do drop-in visits and they can do planned visits, but they are not there as a matter of fact. And so we have to call upon them through, all of these different agencies to be there to protect the people and the river, and to make sure that this is not happening here at Indian Point. Thank you.
If I may add that it's very important that Holtec be prevented, because this is not covered by the law. Holtec be prevented from evaporating the water. Evaporating the water simply gives you radioactive water vapor, and it does come down both as rain and snow and dew, but it also enters the air, and breathing radioactive water vapor, tritium contaminated water vapor, is actually more harmful biologically than drinking the water or eating the food that is contaminated with tritium. So evaporation is no solution, just as dilution is no solution. Evaporation is also no solution. So just one more point, and that is that in order to really address the problem of tritium, one has to have the use of a laboratory which can sample, and you can't really detect tritium directly. It doesn't register on radiation alarm. it doesn't trigger radiation alarm. It's because of the very peculiar kind of radiation given off by tritium, which is not very penetrating. You may think, well, if it's not very penetrating, it's probably not very dangerous. On the contrary, the radiation which is less penetrating is actually far more dangerous, because all of the energy is delivered to one or two cells, and the biological damage is much more concentrated in the body. For example, plutonium also, the radiation from plutonium can't pass through a sheet of paper, and yet it's hundreds of times more dangerous than any other radioactive material. So the fact that it's not penetrating is not a indication of safety at all.
I'd like to stand corrected. I just see that Tina Bunger has said that there is a full-time inspector on site. I hope that really does mean they're really there. Okay, go on, please.
Me too.
So we have two.
I want to ask Dr. Edwards for a website. I do an environmental radio show, and I would like to send our listeners to a website that has all the tritium information that you've been giving us.
Okay, well, there are two websites. I could send them to you by email. If you drop me an email at ccnr. CCNR, that's Charles Norman Roger @web.ca. Send me an email and I will send you links. On our website, which is ccnr.org, we have a section called Troubles with Tritium. And there's also another website which I can steer you to called the Tritium Awareness Project. And both of these websites have a lot of information on tritium.
On behalf of our listeners, I thank you very, very much.
Well, Mana Joe's question is, she said in the Q&A chat, can we get a temporary restraining order or injunction to prevent the discharge, for extra security to prevent the discharge? I think the law is crystal clear. I mean, in conversations with state agency officials earlier this week, they said basically, you know, if Holtec takes any, you know, this is all suspect, you know, but if they seemed like they were going to do that, that would be an immediate enforcement action by the DEC, their Region 4 office. And only if you know, that enforcement action, if Holtec didn't agree and sign a consent order to stop the discharge, then only would DEC refer the case to the Attorney General's office for a temporary restraining order. I believe that's how it works, but of course, please contact the DEC about those details. But that is the sort of the 1-2 step process as we understand it.
Right, because this is now to the state. It's now to the state. Otherwise, we could probably wrap it up. It's about 3 minutes to 1 o'clock. So what I'd like to just say is that to all of the reporters and everyone else who's been present at this news conference, thank you for taking the time today to attend. Can you all hear me? Okay, so thank you very much for taking the time to attend today. Have a great day. And also a special thanks to the Grassroots Environmental Education for facilitating this event. It's a very big job and it's an incredible organization. Their information is in the chat, and you can go to their website as well for a lot of information on everything that has been happening regarding Indian Point, Westchester, Rockland County, etc. So thank you again, and that's it. So
just a PS, there we put in the chat the link to the Grassroots Environmental Education website, where we have the news release with quotes from everyone who spoke, and we have the 6-page detailed sign-on letter, as well as 5 pages of appendices. It's a very detailed, thorough letter making our ask based on law, based on past state practices, and based on the Federal Clean Water Act. And Dr. Edwards, did you want to make any last comments in relation to what's going on at the Pilgrim reactor, supposedly by that whistleblower's report?
As I only understand what I've gleaned from the journalistic accounts, but I gather that they're trying to evaporate the water. I believe that it's the same struggle I think one has to realize that we have entered the age of nuclear waste big time, and that this is going to be a struggle that's going to be our children and grandchildren's struggle too. And we have to set an example to them today, because this is the thin edge of the wedge. Once they start dumping stuff into the river and dumping stuff into the marketplace, there's no end to it. And our environment is going to become increasingly unhealthy because increasingly radioactive. And don't bear in mind that although they often talk about background radiation, that we do get a certain amount of radiation from background, it's true. There is background radiation. But guess what? It's killing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people every single year, background radiation. So don't think that background radiation is safe just because it's background. And number two, most of the radioactive materials we're talking about don't even exist in nature. They were created, they only started existing 80 years ago when nuclear fission was invented. So we have created hundreds of new radioactive materials that don't even exist in nature. And we have to be very much on the alert, because this problem is not going to go away, even if the nuclear industry goes away. And we have to really be protective of our children, our grandchildren, and in fact, the biosphere.
And yes, and I would just also like to say that, you know, here in New York State, we have 3 other plants that I think are going to eventually be decommissioned. I don't know if Holtec's going to be the licensee for those, but we do absolutely need to make sure that we have a real plan moving forward, so that we can do this safely across New York State, and also that it could become, you know, a model for the nation, because this is a national issue as well. It is not just only specific to Indian Point or Pilgrim or New Jersey, Oyster Bay. It's going to be all over the world. And as we all know, tomorrow is the day when the release will be starting for the next 10 years, 20 years, I don't know, 30 years from Japan. And we must do what we can to protect. And I do hope that this plan will be looked at very carefully by our state agencies. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to add, Mana Joe Green's question about a restraining order. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't know what the law is in New York State, but it seems to me like a very good idea, because I think Holtec has already indicated that it has a certain amount of contempt for this state law, and they do believe that they can just override it. So a restraining order might be a good tactical thing in addition to the law. You know, as we've seen, people can choose to break the law. But if they also break a restraining order, I think that puts them into double jeopardy.
Yeah, it's a good point. We'll raise that at our meetings with the state agencies and the governor and attorney general, right, Tina?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of our main questions to them. So,
right.
And thank you.
Put that in place so it can't happen. You know. Thank you very much, everyone.